Hey reader, welcome back here to the channel. This is Centaur here, and we are looking at anti-tank grenades today. To be completely honest, I've already kind of tipped my hand about AT grenades in several of the army reviews I've done so far. And so I figured, you know what, we might as well just get it over with and just do the videos. That way, worst case scenario, when I reference them in the future, I can just point to the video and explain why I think they're bad. Okay, just going to save you some time as you're watching the video, but by all means, for the algorithm, feel free to just let this run in the background. It might be interesting to listen to while you paint, or just confirm your deep set theories that maybe you don't like these. Okay, we are going to caveat this a little bit near the end as we look at anti-tank grenades and also Molotov cocktails, which are really just AT grenades for the purposes of bolt action. And we're going to look at how it's changed from second edition to third edition, because I do think on the one hand, there is more usefulness to them now, but at the same time, there's less usefulness to them now. And so we'll talk about that as we go along. But just letting you know in advance, in general, I would not recommend these. Okay, and this video is mostly going to look at why. To start off with, by the way, we're also going to change up the order in which we typically do review. So we're going to start with range and rate of fire like we always do. But then we're going to move damage out of order. We're going to look at damage before we look at opportunity cost and pin generation, because typically these are done in that order, where it's, what am I passing up in order to take this? And then how likely is it to pin something? And then beyond pinning, how likely is it to damage something? Ironically, it's almost the exact opposite for AT grenades. We need to first look at what its potential is for damage, because that's going to give us our opportunity cost. And then pins are actually really weird. It's the only weapon in the game that does pins in this order. But it really does make sense to look at pins afterwards because of all of that. Okay, so it's going to be a little bit different from our normal stuff. We're going to look at nation considerations, because frankly, some nations just don't have the same anti-tank and anti-armor options that other nations have. They're pretty limited, typically because it's early war. And so because of that, it might make more sense to take anti-tank grenades over and against other heavy weapon options that they have as a means of doing effective anti-armor. So we'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about target prioritization, what realistically you can look at in light of the damage chart that we're going to be looking at, and our cool map there. We're going to look at accessibility, because some nations get access to them. Some of them get restricted access to AT grenades, and some don't get access to AT grenades at all. And so for some nations, even if you like them, it doesn't matter. You can't take them, or you'll have to take them on a very expensive veteran unit. And so knowing that when you're going into it not only helps, I think, to make the case as to why you really don't need them in the overwhelming majority of armies, but also it might explain why you might have some hesitancy toward running them over and against other options. And then finally, we're going to talk about the one tiny change that I would recommend, as well as a boring alternative option that I might recommend as a means of fixing anti-tank grenades. So for starters, in both second and third edition, the range and rate of fire hasn't changed. The range is close combat, so you have to successfully assault a vehicle. More on that a little bit later. And then after doing that, you're going to roll for each man in the squad to determine what the level of your hit is. So toward that end, a 6-man squad is going to roll 6 dice. 8-man squad is going to roll 8 dice, but this is based, of course, on how many men are actually assaulting the vehicle. So if your goal is to get 6 men in, or 8 men in, or 10 men in, and you think you're going to take some casualties before that, you might actually need to take 8, 10, 12, or even more men just to make sure that you actually arrive with the numbers that you want. Okay? So what this means, just practically speaking, I kind of show a little quick breakdown of that. If you have a squad of 8 men that you purchase, right, you're going to purchase anti-tank grenades for all of those, right? But then if 2 of them are wounded before engaging the enemy, then even though you purchased 8 anti-tank grenades, you're only going to get to use 6, because each man only uses 1. Okay? There's one hiccup to this in terms of range and rate of fire. So in most cases, we would just talk about you have to be 12 inches away, 24 inches away, 48 inches away, or whatever the ranges of the weapon. In this case, you could be within charge range. But if the unit that you're charging, the vehicle that you're charging, has already been assigned a run order or an advance order, you actually can't charge them. The rule is you cannot charge a moving vehicle, which means as long as they have run or advance on them, that's the end of it. Now, this does lead to some wonky stuff. So, for example, if somebody assigns a tank or a Stug 3, right, or something like that, an advance order, so that way they can change that forward facing, or even just because they know that they want to avoid being charged with anti-tank grenades. They could just pivot on the spot as part of an advance and then perform their action, and you actually can't charge them. Even though physically they're in the same spot, they just changed their facing. Technically speaking, they're a moving vehicle, which means no can do, no charge for the AT grenades. The second problem is, you know, we talked about how you get to roll dice for each man that's in the unit in order to perform the attack. Well, this is where things get complicated, and in general, I don't like complicated. You pick up your dice, you roll them, and on a 4 plus, they contribute a +1 penetration to your eventual damage roll. So you can see there I did a quick chart showing how many men at 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 men you'd have, what you could reliably expect for that penetration modifier. So you're rolling a dice for each man. 4 plus allows you to contribute. You can reasonably expect a pen +1 to a pen +5, again, 50% toward the total. Okay. And then after that, you get to roll one dice. Again, it's only one dice. And this is part of the problem with this. It's actually the same issue that we had with anti-tank guns, right? Where you're only rolling the one dice to try to wound. So maybe it wounds, maybe it doesn't. Pin generation is pretty reliable. Damage is iffy. It all depends on what you're shooting at. And in this case, the math here, by the way, is quite simple, really. You're hitting against the top armor on all of them. So even though the AT grenades might only have, say, a pen +3 modifier, it's actually going to become a pen +4 modifier, okay, which is kind of nice. So we've inherently factored in a bit of an extra bump into all of these, okay? And so you'll notice that technically, you know, if you're adding that pen +1, you know, the penetration modifiers are going across the top. The armor value that you're trying to hit, the damage value that you're trying to hit is going there along the side. A glancing hit is whatever that penetration value is +6 and then one more after that because you're hitting the top armor, which is always an extra +1. Okay. So the nice thing is even a pen +1, it can actually damage a damage value 7 plus vehicle. In this case, you'd have to roll the 6. So it's about a 16.67% chance to do it. And then in order to destroy it, you would need to roll a 4 plus on the damage chart, right? Because even if you set it on fire on a 3, it might not leave, especially in 3rd edition, where we have a lot more morale bubbles running around, okay? So toward that end, it comes out to about half of a 16.67% chance, about a 1 in 12 chance, which is 8.33% chance of destroying a vehicle. And that's if it's damage value 7, okay? You're doing a glancing hit at an 8 plus, which means you would need to roll a 6 on the damage roll. You would need to roll another 6 to set it on fire. And then you have a chance to destroy it, right? They'd have to fail the morale test after that point. But even just getting to that setting the vehicle on fire is a 2.78% chance. Not particularly high, okay? As you get to a damage value 9 or damage value 10, at that point, you don't actually have the penetration to actually damage it, which is problematic. And again, this is the same issue that you run into with light mortars, heavy machine guns, and the like. So this is not particularly surprising for heavy weapons. And of course, you could get higher than this on everything, right? But this is the argument for why you want to make sure you have a lot of men arriving. Because as you can slide across the chart, you notice eventually even a damage value 10 plus tank, which is the highest you're likely to see, and feel like maybe you want to handle it by charging it, which just has other questions that we'll talk about a little bit later, okay? Even then, at least you have a chance of being able to do damage. And I use 25% kind of as the cutoff because you know what? A 50% chance of doing damage and then a 50% chance of actually removing it is actually not horrible chances when it comes to anti-tank removal, especially as you start getting to damage value 9, for example. So I put all of those in bold to say, like, that's the reasonable means that you'd have of doing removal, which means if you're going up against light tanks reliably, you would want to have a pen +4 at least walking into it, which looking at our simple stats up there at the top, you're looking at about 8 men actually reaching the target. Now, on a veteran squad, an 8-man squad is about the biggest you would probably want to go. You're looking at a pretty expensive squad at that point. It's already over 100 points normally. You're at least 120 points by the time you factor in the anti-tank grenades. Suffice it to say, at least for now on the damage chart, this is not good damage. Just so we're all on the same page. This is not good damage, especially considering what you're going to pay for it. But just even as a chart, this is not great, okay? Especially since, as we mentioned, you may not get the charge, okay? They could simply pivot and suddenly you're sitting there for another turn waiting to charge, You don't get to do what literally every other heavy weapon in the game gets to do, which is just declare a fire action, right? You've been denied this. So something just to think about. Well, I guess technically the Japanese lunge mine is in a similar boat, right? We'll talk about that a little bit later. So when we look at the opportunity cost, this is part of the problem, right? Is that you have a scaling cost. Unlike, say, a Panzerfaust that you buy for 15 points or a light machine gun that you buy for 15 points, the number of points you're paying for anti-tank grenades scales based on the size of the squad. So you can go cheaper than, say, 20 points, right? You would just have to take less than 10 men in the squad. And technically, a 5-man squad can get up to a pen plus 5, which, as you'll note, I'll go back up here. Pen plus 5 is kind of the sweet spot. You've actually got a really good chance of doing damage to a lot of stuff. Pretty reasonable, at least for bolt action standards, okay? Technically, a 5-man squad can get to that, right? Because you have a ceiling of, you could roll a 4 plus on every single dice, right? Reasonably, I wouldn't plan on that. Okay, if that's your strategy going into it, that your 6-man squad is only going to lose 1 man going in, and then the 5 remaining guys are all going to get the 4 plus, and so you're going to get a good penetration roll. I'm just going to tell you now, you're going to be let down at least a couple times in any given game. Okay, so realistically, you're looking at closer to like a 10-man squad in order to get that pen plus 5, which is 20 points plus the cost of the squad, and as we'll see later, plus however many squads you want to do this on, okay? Because that does actually make a difference in terms of the math, okay? Now, as a quick comparison, you have the 15-point Panzerfaust. In that case, it's only a one-shot, one-use item, so you only get one chance at it. But it's a guaranteed pen plus 6, and it doesn't suffer a -1 to its penetration from being at long range, so you could be at the full 12-inch range, and you could use it from ambush, so that way you reduce, for example, the chance at a cover save. You can also use it against a vehicle that has moved, so it is slightly more reliable, and it is probably hitting on a 4 or a 5. Although, since you could like advance up into within 6 inches, you could be hitting on something like a 3. Or, in that rare instance where maybe you move up on a given turn and then you get to activate before the tank does, you might get to be at point blank range without any penalties and hit on 2s. Okay? Compare this to the static 4s of the anti-tank grenade. I think, honestly, it's about the same. The big difference is that for 15 points, you accomplished what would take you on average 12 men to do. So 24 points versus 15 points, and that extra margin is just, well, you only get to attempt it once, whereas you could technically attempt it multiple times with the same squad. Okay, hopefully getting enough men in there to actually do the penetration that you need. Okay, in general, I think if I'm looking at giving infantry an anti-tank based weapon, I'm probably going to lean toward a 15-point Panzerfaust over and against anti-tank grenades. So that cuts out about a third of the armies in the books that just off the top, you probably wouldn't want to take AT grenades on if you were looking for an anti-armor solution. You'd probably just go with a Panzerfaust. Because if nothing else, the Panzerfaust is offering the exact same mental issue of, oh, I really don't want my tank within 12 inches of this unit, right? Except that it's actually even better because it's actually within like 18 inches of that unit, because then they could advance and still fire the Panzerfaust. And so, you know, like there's a lot of psychological game that's going on there that does happen with AT grenades. The problem is that AT grenades in general are just like you have to get in an awful lot closer, and you can whittle down their effectiveness by whittling down the number of men, even though they paid for the full amount to use that benefit, right? And of course, this scales, the scaling issue doesn't end there. It scales based on how many squads you want. If the opponent knows you only have one squad with anti-tank grenades, what they're going to do is they're just going to shoot at that with a bunch of machine guns. They're going to shoot at it with snipers. They're going to just, not even caring who they get rid of. They're just trying to whittle down the unit, because at some point when it reaches like 6 men, on average, you're not actually going to do damage to even a light tank. And your chances of doing damage even to an armored car is not particularly good. It's a 50-50 chance that you do damage at all. So toward that end, it's not like they really need to remove the threat. They can just whittle it down and then go about doing their business, right? Going about their day. Whereas with a Panzerfaust, they pretty much have to get you down to 2 men left, right, in the squad. Because as long as the Panzerfaust is on a guy that's important, I'd put it on the guy with the light machine gun, personally, because I really care about removing armor. I'll go 1 turn without firing the light machine gun. Doesn't matter. But it guarantees that it's down to like my 2nd man left, right, in the squad. So now they got to chew through the entire squad in order to get to the Panzerfaust. Otherwise, I can still use it. So the threat is still there at full strength, full capacity. Not a problem, right? Whereas with AT grenades, the moment you start losing men, you're actually losing effectiveness on your anti-tank option. And of course, opportunity cost doesn't count in the fact that we still have to buy the squad in the first place, right? So even an 8-man regular infantry section is going to cost 80 points. And then you're going to have 16 points of AT grenades on top of that. So if you're taking 3 squads, so that way you have reasonable threats scattered across the battlefield to deal with enemy armor, you're looking at 240 points. That's almost a quarter of your points at 1,000 points. That's about a third of your points, not too far off of a third of your points. Oh, I'm sorry, I got the math wrong. That it's still a sizable number of points even at 1250. Yeah, we'll just got that section. It's a sizable number of points at 1250. Almost 20% of your points at 1250, which just to get your regular riflemen and no benefit if you don't get in nice and close, which by the way, I generally wouldn't do with regulars. Just so you have the option of doing anti-armor rolls. There's a lot of people who are going to look and they're going to say, look, if I'm taking regular riflemen, especially if I'm taking them with a light machine gun, I don't want them being that close to enemy armor. So I'm not going to take AT grenades, which means you're probably not putting them on regulars. You're probably putting them on veterans, which means the cost is actually even higher, right? I mean, it's close to 120 points a squad. At that point, you're looking at upwards of 350 points if you're taking 3 8-man squads to try to get this done. And remember, an 8-man squad, even if it makes it there with every single man intact, you drop them off in a transport and they suddenly jump out, and then the next turn they jump in and they go and assault against a vehicle. Even then, you're looking at pen plus 4, plus 5 because it's going against the top armor. So maybe a glance against a tank. Maybe you do damage, but it's an iffy proposition. And now you're right there in close range, point blank range with that vehicle. I just think there are maybe better ways to spend your points than taking AT grenades. And this is doubled down by the fact that you're not even just paying for pins, right? So like when I take an anti-tank gun of any style, even a light anti-tank gun, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but I do think has its place for an awful lot of armies, especially the early war armies that don't get access to anything above pen plus 4 in their army. The major issue with anti-tank grenades is there is no innate pin generated by using an anti-tank grenade. You first have to roll your dice to see what your penetration modifier is. Then you roll to do damage to the tank. And then based on what damage you do, you actually get to add pins or not, right? If you run up to the tank and you only stick one little sticky bomb on there, or you throw one of these like mace grenade things that the Germans used at the enemy, and it doesn't actually damage them, they shrug it off. And you're done, right? Like that's the problem, okay? Whereas with literally every single other vehicle, like a heavy machine gun, which is relatively cheap as far as heavy weapons go, shooting at stuff, a Panzerfaust shooting at stuff for only 15 points if it hits, it's gonna pin, right? And then you check damage and you see if you get some extra pins on top of that. But I mean, you've got pretty good chances of doing pins with other stuff. In this case, the pins come an awful lot later. So even if we assume 2 charges with a single squad, which is actually pretty unlikely. Most squads only get in 1 charge for pretty obvious reasons, which is destroy the tank or not, they're right up there with the enemy. There's a reasonable chance they're going to get picked off and they're going to start losing stuff to the point at which even if you did charge again, you wouldn't actually do anything to another vehicle. But even if we assume 2 effective charges that actually result in damage, we'll assume there are 10 men, so that way this is a reasonable mathematics-based approach. You're looking at 5 points per squad per pin, which across 2, 3, 4 squads is somewhere between 5 and 20 points per pin that you're actually paying. Okay. This is not actually very good odds. A lot of these squads are going to end up losing men before they arrive. They're going to end up rolling somewhere above or below average, which means maybe they do damage, maybe they don't. Reliably, from experience, having faced guys who are running like all AT grenades on veteran British paratroopers in order to try to do damage to damage value 7 and damage value 8 vehicles, you're going to get 2 charges across all of your squads for the entire game is what's likely to happen, okay? Because most people are not going to be dumb enough to run their tank up again, and this is part of what we assume whenever we do these math deep dives. We are assuming competency on our opponent, Okay. They're going to keep their tanks back. They're going to use their supporting fire machine guns to just lay into you. They're going to have infantry come and try to smoke you out first. You're going to have to actually come out in order to come get them. They're not going to run their tank at you. Okay. Even a flamethrower tank, which is a pretty rare proposition, is likely to move up and try to flamethrower unit to remove whole sections of a unit before they go in. And remember, flamethrower, no cover save. Okay. Therein lies part of the problem. Okay. As the flamethrower is going in, yeah, they may have some issues afterwards, but that assumes you actually can make it to them with anything close to a semblance of numbers, which is a legitimate question. Okay. Now, that being said, there are some nations and some army builds that are going to look at AT grenades and say, this is actually a pretty good option. Okay. And so to demonstrate this, the first example, and I think the most obvious example, is Norway. Norway only has light howitzers and light and medium mortars as their only heavy weapons, which means they max out at a pen plus 2, right? And all of these are also pretty stationary, right? Like, a light mortar can technically move 6 inches and then fire. But again, we're talking about a pen plus 1, plus 2 for being on the top of the vehicle, which is not particularly great odds if you actually want to do anything to the vehicle. It's not good removal. So if your strategy is, I don't just want to pin vehicles, I want to remove vehicles, light mortars are probably not going to cut it. They're really designed for a different strategy, which is harassing and causing tanks to have to rally. And if they remove them, fantastic, but we're not planning on it. The math is not good for it, okay? In that situation, anti-tank grenades on your veteran sections could be worthwhile. Now, we're currently in an issue in 3rd edition. 2nd edition, this math held up, where it really did make sense to just take royal bodyguards. In fact, overwhelmingly, people who ran Norway at 1,000 points in a tournament setting were basically running all veteran infantry. That's all they were doing, was just the royal bodyguards, okay? In this case, in 3rd edition, we're actually in a bit of an interesting spot because you're not allowed to add extra men to a Norwegian Royal Guard squad, which means you're stuck at 5 dudes, which leaves you at pen plus 2, pen plus 3 reliably, ceiling of pen plus 5. So you could get up to 5 if you rolled really, really well. Personally, seeing as your ceiling with the others is a pen plus 1 or a pen plus 2, pen plus 2, pen plus 3 if you're firing indirect and you hit on top, but that's not particularly likely to happen. You might be well off taking AT grenades. It's a reasonable option. It might also just be that you want to have more anti-armor options all around, and you don't just want to be relying on relatively fragile platforms like mortar teams and howitzers, which are only 3 men, probably regular. So you might take AT grenades. I don't think it's a great option, but if somebody argued they were going to do it, I'd believe them. It's fine. Okay, it's a reasonable request. Partisans are another option. Their vehicles are not particularly great. They, again, have access to things like light AT guns and light howitzers and light anti-aircraft guns as artillery options, but you might want something that's a little more mobile that can smoke things out. And if that's the case, you might take 20 to 40 points worth of AT grenades on a 10 to 20 man squad instead of taking a 50 to 80 point damage value 6 light anti-tank gun on the back of a truck, right? So if that's your options, that's pretty reasonable. I could see that going. You might also just see it as a theme thing where you're like, well, I just want to run with a bunch of infantry. If that's the case, hey, fair enough. Lead the mobs to war and take some anti-tank grenades, Molotov cocktails, whatever you want to call them, right? It could also be a historical, especially veteran-heavy army. So, with the new Armies of Germany and, Armies of the United States books, if you're running, say, like a full U.S. Rangers list and you have to take everybody veteran and you want to run it more historical, so you're only bringing like maybe anti-tank guns, probably 75 millimeter pack howitzers, light howitzers with you, that's not very good anti-tank, right? You might want something with a bit of more punch. And if you're taking 8-man Ranger sections and doing Rangers lead the way the whole way in, so that way you can start a little bit further up, it might be worthwhile to take 16 points per squad of AT grenades. That might actually be worthwhile. I'd probably still run it a little bit differently, but then again, I'd be running, U.S. Rangers with armor support. So, that's why it would look a little bit different. But hypothetically, one could do that. Okay. And I would buy that. But honestly, for pretty much everybody else, I would skip it. And part of the reason for that is because when it comes to targets that you can prioritize, they really aren't that many and they aren't very good. Okay. They work fine against damage value 7 empty armored transports. Of course, they don't really work against manned and like loaded transports, which is kind of ironic because for every other thing we're going to be reviewing from a pin generation and a damage perspective, you want transports to always have men in them. With anti-tank grenades, you don't. Because if you assault a transport with people in them, then the people inside can get out and you fight them instead. You don't actually get a chance to fight against the transport. In which case, you're now sitting there, and the transport then turns its machine gun, light machine gun, medium machine gun, heavy machine gun, whatever it is, towards you, and they light you up. And because they have an advance order, if you had another squad nearby to try to attack the transport, congratulations, you now can't do the you can't charge the transport because it's a moving transport. It has an advance order on it, right? So, like it's tricky. You really want an empty armored transport that hasn't activated yet in an ideal world or had to produce a fire action or a rally action or something like that. Or went down, right? Like, if something recce's away, then that's a perfectly fine choice. And they tend to be damage value 7 or damage value 8 if they're recce tanks or armored vehicles. Then as long as they have a down order on them, then you can charge them. But there's a good chance your opponent's going to have enemies nearby and they're not just going to let you have their transport, right? It could be that this is a damage value 7, just other armored vehicle, right? It could be an armored car of some kind. It could be a small little tankette, something like that. It's a fine option. This is, one of the ideal things you'd want to do. Ideally, one that's already declared a fire action. So that way it can't shoot at you as you're trying to come in. And it isn't an ineligible target and it's not going to, wreck you away from you, right? But those are fine options. You could also go for a damage value 8 empty armored transport. These are less common, but they do exist. Or a damage value 8 armored vehicle, some sort of light tank. These are also fine. Your chances of wounding are not particularly great, especially if you're down to like 5 or 6 men. They're not particularly good odds, but you can do it. But pretty much beyond that, honestly, I wouldn't want to try it against literally anything else. Your odds are not very good. The math is not great. It doesn't hold up. So personally, I'd punt. I think for the number of men you're likely to get in, which is probably X minus 2 to 5, whatever size squad you started with, minus 2 to 5 men, that's the likely amount you're likely to get in there. I just don't see the math helping you out to hit anything above that. And for that same ability, an anti-tank gun of any kind, a light AT gun on anything, a low velocity AT gun on most anything is probably acceptable. A howitzer is probably acceptable. An autocannon is probably comparable for what you're looking at. So as we look at accessibility, there's some other math that we need to take into consideration, which is that, frankly, some people just can't take AT grenades. This includes nations like Bulgaria, Greece, the Netherlands, and Poland. They don't get access to any AT grenades across the board. Okay? For those of us who don't like AT grenades, this is a plus. And part of the reason why I don't mind playing Greece, don't mind playing Poland, don't mind playing the Netherlands, haven't collected Bulgaria yet, though I intend to. Okay? Because it does work. There are also some nations where you're restricted only to veterans. This includes nations like Belgium and Norway, where you only really get access to them on your very expensive units. This is taking a 13-point veteran infantryman to a 15-point veteran infantryman, but he can now assault a tank with AT grenades. 15 points per man is a lot, any which way you cut it. There are some nations that open it up where you just can't take it on an inexperienced infantryman. So Italy is one example. I included Finland and Romania, but Finland and Romania also don't have any inexperienced infantry. So that's more just because of kind of a weird quirk about the way that their armies work, is that they don't get access to inexperienced dudes who then, by nature of that, don't get access to AT grenades. But it means you can take them a little bit cheaper if you want to risk regulars running in to assault something, which maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. You could, hypothetically, take these at regular and go cheaper and save yourself some points over the veterans. And then you also have armies that have easy access. There are some armies where you can take this on inexperienced troops. If you're planning on taking bamboo spear fighters, you can take anti-tank grenades on bamboo spear fighters for dirt cheap with Japan. At that point, you're paying 7 points per man. They were already having to get into melee anyway. Might as well give them some explosives, right? That is one way to do it. Right. There are other ways. Partisans are also a common example of this, where maybe you just want to run inexperienced infantry because they do work, by the way. And especially if you're taking them with pistols or something like that, like you could in second edition, AT grenades were very cheap. You don't have access to kitting everybody out with pistols in third edition, so they're going to be slightly more expensive. The fact that pistols are now also only a -1 means even if we get that back with the Partisans book, whenever that arrives, they're still going to be more expensive than a regular inexperienced dude with a rifle. But suffice it to say, like you do have some options for this, right, across the board. If you're looking for cheap and experienced troops to charge a tank, I'm just going to be honest, just expect you're going to lose quite a few guys before you get in there. Because if they know that you paid a premium on these, they're going to try to remove some of them. So what change would I make? Well, there's the boring change, which is you just make it less of a tax, right? You make it 1 point per man instead of 2 points per man. And suddenly outfitting 4 squads of 8 to 10 men being only 32 to 40 points, that's less than what you would pay for a light howitzer. That's less than you would pay for an anti-tank gun and probably more effective, right? Regardless of veterancy level. Frankly, I think that's boring. So, and in general, I don't like playing around with it because I think what we actually have here is we missed an opportunity. We made things overly complicated and we don't have to do that. What we should instead do is we should present an alternative where an anti-tank grenade is a pen +5 across the board, and it doesn't add anything else. It's really pen +4, but it's going against the top armor, so it gets a +1, which makes it pen +5. And then what happens is each man rolls to hit, and you're looking for a 4+. And then based on how many of those hit, you pick up your hits and you roll them again at a pen +5, right? So you're rolling extra dice. You're not actually boosting the difficulty to penetrate. This means that a 6-man squad is actually relatively reasonably effective, which is good because between shooting at you as you're trying to cross the board, potential reactive fire against the charge, and the ability to wreck you away, move away, or gimp you out of stuff by simply taking a movement action of some kind by the vehicle, we've already made it difficult to get to do the attack in the first place, so we have to incentivize it. So I would say pen +5, rolling number of hits, and then you pick up the number of hits, and that's the number of chances you get to try to wound. You're seeing if a guy can get it inside and actually do serious damage. Okay? That's what I would do. Alternatively, I would also present, and maybe not alternatively, but as an alternative to anti-tank grenades, I would allow people to take Molotov cocktails. They would cost the exact same amount, and they would be pen +2, so it becomes pen +3 against the top, right? You know, they're improvised. They're not nearly as good. You could even leave it potentially at pen +2. That's totally fine as well. But they would also add D3 pins, okay? So what it really is that if you hit with at least one, there's fire on it, you're adding pins to the vehicle, so it becomes a pin generator that might also remove, again, filling that secondary strategy of what you might want. So in that sense, it's an awful lot like a flamethrower, except that it doesn't get a bonus, it doesn't force a morale test against it. That being said, D3 pins is actually hard to get in 3rd edition nowadays because so many things drop down to D2 pins instead. So, you're looking at very expensive medium howitzers, heavy howitzers, and, really, really big heavy weapons in order to get the D3. Heavy mortars and some of the AT guns, but when you start really, really getting into AT guns. So if that's the case, getting this on a Molotov cocktail is not bad, I think. And considering the fact that, again, this is supposed to be improvised at home, I don't have a problem with it being basically like a flamethrower, but not exactly like a flamethrower. I think that's fine. If this is what anti-tank grenades looked like, and we're going to include this as one of our optional rules in the Zern mission pack, if this is what they looked like, I think we would actually see a lot more people running them because it incentivizes you to take a risk, a really big risk, which is potentially throwing away an infantry squad that might even cost more than the armor that you're removing in order to have a chance to remove some armor. Okay. It's going to have to still be used tactically. You're going to have to be smart in how you do it. But it presents, I think, a reasonable strategic assessment that giving your men effectively, close range explosives is worthwhile. And I think that's what we're really lacking right now. And that's the reason why when you see lists that are built for a really competitive edge at a tournament, you don't see a lot of AT grenades. It's because people looked at the math, they looked at experience, and they said, these don't work. And I would really, really like every option that's on a unit's profile to work. Do you agree? Do you think that I'm being harsh or unfair to AT grenades? Have I been too fair? Have I been too understanding? If so, let me know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.